Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with parapsychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring varieties of meditative experience, particularly as experienced by Americans and other Westerners since the counterculture of the 1960s. My guest today is Matthew Ingram, who's in London. He's the author of Retreat, How the Counterculture Invented Wellness. And now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Matthew. It's a pleasure to be with you once again.
Thanks very much, Jeffrey, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Well, we're going to deviate a little bit from the counterculture and the work on its contribution to wellness in your book, Retreat. We're going to talk specifically about meditation, which is a vast subject, and I'd like to begin by asking you about your own interest. I know, for example, you did travel to India, so I assume you have a very serious interest in this subject.
I've meditated since I was probably about 30 years now, in a sort of Vipassana style, just sort of bare attention. But in the course of the book, I started using a mantra, which is a very different dynamic. And so I sort of mix them up a bit. So I do a mantra every day, and so it's something that I get a lot out of, and it's very sort of soothing, and you feel connected to something bigger than yourself.
I'm aware that when I talk about meditation, it can mean many different things to different people. And I think that's because people meditate for different reasons. Some people want to clear their mind. Other people want insight into themselves. Other people want to develop greater power of concentration. I imagine that when we look at your life or the people that you studied, going back to how meditation came to the United States in a big way, starting in the 1960s, many of these different motives get intertwined with each other.
On the one level, there's a confusion of how the different traditions were in this transition, especially around the counterculture and that era. So there's a big mixture, and in a way, we still live with that legacy of that combination. So we have different techniques, sometimes packaged up together, where actually they can be disentangled, and they're actually quite different aims, different end aims. The classic example is of a sort of a Vedic or Vedanta style meditation with, the use of a mantra. So, for instance, in the 60s, the Hare Krishna movement and transcendental meditation were very big on that. And then with that style, you have the sort of what the Buddhists call samatha, which is a concentration on a fixed object. And those styles are very much about clearing the mind. And the analogy is often used in the Vedas of a lake with, cloudy waters and waves on the surface. And the whole idea with that style of meditation is to calm the lake. And when the lake is calm, you can see the bottom. And the bottom is the big gift, which is the self, which is this cosmic gift. And then there's the Buddhist style of meditation, which is called, bare attention or Vipassana. And that's very much about being in the present and feeling your emotions. It's not an escapist sense, but I think, and those currents came over in the counterculture. And certainly in the counterculture, in the first instance, the impetus to transcend and to use the Vedic style or the mantra in that sense was the strongest one, because that was the impetus of that movement. So, but yes, it's a as you say, as you mentioned, it's a huge subject and has very complicated cross currents. But those are the two big ones that came across.
Well, I know that in your writing, you emphasize the fact that it's very hard to isolate meditation from the culture in which it arose or in which it's practiced. And when meditation came to North America and to Europe from Asia, you have a mingling of some very, very different cultures. And so on top of all of the different schools of meditation and styles of meditation and purposes for meditation, in addition, you have this culture clash going on, which I should think adds an enormous amount of chaos to the process of integrating meditative practices into Western society.
These are practices that have come to being over, hundreds, sometimes thousands of years, and they're embedded in cultures very explicitly. And then they came over, as, sort of isolated packages and were recontextualized. I mean, one of the first examples is, and this was infuriating, I know, for the Maharishi Yogi, when he came over to San Francisco, all the newspapers described transcendental meditation as a new form of medicine. In the first case, he was absolutely like, this is not what we're about at all. But then I think he thought, well, maybe we should work with this, and if this is how, it slots into the prevailing culture, let's run with it. But in all of these instances, there was a lot of stuff lost in translation, and a lot of stuff was confused. But so, for instance, in terms of things being lost in translation, the likes of, D.T. Suzuki or Chogyam Trungpa, they would bring these techniques over, especially the Buddhist techniques. Key elements, for instance, non-attachment or compassion would be discarded. And you have, the meditation on its own. And obviously that's caused confusion and, social confusion, as well as, cultural confusion.
I gather that the people who were initially attracted to meditative practices largely came out of the counterculture. That's one of the reasons in the first place that they took a strong interest in Asian traditions in general as something alternative to Western spiritual traditions. And that created a funny dynamic because many of these gurus really wanted to reach the mainstream of America and Europe, not necessarily the fringes.
That's exactly right. To choose a different example, Prabhupada, who the Hare Krishna guru, he came over to New York in 1965 at about the age of 70. He didn't really have any inkling of who his audience would be or who the people were. He wasn't enamored of hippies in particular. And obviously the Maharishi Yogi, his first audience was very uptight. Uptight. They were sort of, smart 50s women with bouffant hairdos and accountants and the like. So when, the likes of Prudence Farrow-Bruns and whenever were joining the early transcendental meditation classes, they were in a distinct minority. Even in London, they weren't full of hippies at all. It was working people, and that was what he wanted to appeal to.
Well, when the Beatles went over to India and studied with the Maharishi, that single event seemed to have an enormous cultural ripple.
Everybody was watching. I mean, the level of the attention on them, especially in that kind of era of, narrow band media where, unlike, the internet where we have hundreds of channels, in the UK, I think we probably had 2 television channels, everything was focused on them. To go back to the Hare Krishnas, I know that when they saw on television the Beatles with Maharishi Yogi and Rishikesh, they actually decided from their base in San Francisco that they needed to send somebody to London to capture George Harrison, to capture their own Beatle. And so, everybody was watching, everybody was paying attention, everybody was following what they did. So, yeah, I think it was, single most important event in many respects. And on many levels, the book is a Beatles book. I mean, they come through so many of these different disciplines.
And I gather it was a rather eventful time. The Beatles went to India. They were there, I think, sincerely to study meditation with the Maharishi, and he was probably caught up in the glamour of that, the news. But as I recall, the Beatles left very disillusioned. I
think the most authoritative version I've heard is that he did he felt up Maya Farrow. I think she describes feeling his little hands going up her in the dark, and then through the agency of this Greek electronics guru who Apple had got hold of, who was sort of tailing them at the time, called Alex Mardus. He stirred the pot, and they all stormed off and said, legendarily giving us the sort of Sexy Sadie song, which is obviously Sexy Sadhu. But I mean, the thing was, for a long time, I think the Maharishi Yogi feigned ignorance and pretended that he didn't know what was going on. I think it was 6 months later that he actually, one of his followers, he asked them, so what was it all about? What was it all about? And they said, well, they said that you fondled up one of the women, and his remark, but don't they know that I'm a renunciate? I would never do that. And actually, and over time, there's been a lot of a lot of things have come out of the woodwork. There's a book written by a woman called Judith Bork. I think it's robes of clay, feet of clay, robes of silk, and describing the extended affair he had with her, and how he then subsequently went on to other women. And so I mean, I think he was always at it, really. This was a time of the sexual liberation movement. The birth control pill had become quite popular. There was, I think it was even referred to as a sexual revolution going on. People were taking psychedelic drugs. And when you combine that with what is sometimes a very austere movement of monastic meditation, you've really got an interesting stew brewing. The connection with the drugs is very interesting, because I know as you pointed out in in previous conversations that we've had, that the Vedic tradition had previously had some accommodation for that, and even when the Beatles were there, they would have seen sadhus smoking charas, but so the psychedelic aspect was very much, hand in hand with the meditation side of it. You also had gurus like Chogyam Trungpa coming over, emphasizing, I think, what they referred to as the crazy wisdom tradition, which is that a truly spiritual enlightened person is completely unconstrained by social mores. And I interviewed Trungpa at one time. I think we discussed it in a previous interview. He was chain smoking, and I understand that he was a heavy drinker and also felt quite comfortable having sex with his students. And in fact, many of the meditation teachers and gurus fell into this, I have to call it a trap, of getting sexually involved with their students, with often damaging consequences. Yes, I mean, there was a very sort of a landmark survey done in 1984 by the Vipassana teacher Jack Kornfield, and I think he interviewed, I think it was 80 teachers of various disciplines, and like over 50% of them had slept with their students, and there was a particularly nasty denouement in Trungpa's case. It wasn't directly related to him, but his lead abbot I think it was Ösel was infected with AIDS and was sleeping with his students and infected a lot of them with AIDS. But I mean that's just the tip of the iceberg. I think it was Satchidananda, I know, slept with his students. Muktananda has a lot of very shady business there. It goes right the way through, and obviously Trungpa, as you've mentioned, and as Maharishi Yogi, as we've talked about. I think people are put in quite a receptive state, and I think there was an idealized vision of these people, and I think it must have been terribly sad for a man or a woman to go into that position of seeking help, seeking guidance, and to find oneself being used sexually. And obviously there were people who there were this was the era of the groupie after all. There were people who willingly slept with a guru, but I think that in many cases it does seem like it was an exploitative relationship.
There is a sense that you want to get close to a person who seems closer to the truth, closer to God. And the idea of having an intimate sexual encounter with a true guru undoubtedly was very attractive to many disciples. I have no doubt of that.
Oh, that's right.
If we go back, though, to the very beginning, it seems to me the early Beat generation, people like Allen Ginsberg, who had enormous psychological problems, spent a lot of time with psychiatrists, as did Ram Dass, sought meditation as a form of psychotherapy, really.
Yes, that's right. And I think we've briefly mentioned how when Maharishi Yogi came, meditation was described as a form of medicine, but there was a sort of an intellectual tradition, especially around Zen, whereby it was understood, the Buddhism especially was understood as a form of psychotherapy. So writings by Erich Fromm and obviously Jung wrote the introduction to Tibetan Book of the Dead, it was. And Alan Watts as well wrote a very wonderful book, Psychoanalysis East and West, which looked explicitly at how the guru, the Roshi, or in Zen, was essentially someone who was forcing a state of kind of what Jung would describe as individuation by interacting with the student, by forcing a student, by essentially breaking their ego down. And so, although in fact, in Buddhism, people look slightly askance at this and like, oh no, here come the Jungians. But I think that it's unmistakable similarities between the processes. And yes, absolutely, Ginsberg, who was a therapy junkie, came to the mantra, for instance, as a form of as a technique for cutting his rumination, and he approached Buddhism, the Zazen, the process of sitting, as in an authentic enough way, as a way of dealing with trauma, processing trauma, and that whole process of sitting and just being with those sticky emotions and those unpleasant feelings is, it's akin in a way to the process of psychoanalysis. We sit with a psychoanalyst and just say what's on your mind. I mean, there's an equivalence.
At the same time, as we've discussed in our interview previously on the human potential movement, and incidentally, I'm going to link to it in case viewers haven't seen it. It's a wonderful interview. Many forms of new therapy were being developed in the West. And you have a wonderful story about the Primal Scream therapists and how they I think it was they came to Jack Kornfield for meditative experience, and it was something of a conflict for them. Am I supposed to emote, or am I supposed to hold it all in?
Cornfield just advised them, don't go with this sort of, ab reaction principle, but just, sit with your feelings. And I think they all were like, oh my God, we need to be screaming. But, and he was like, no, just sit with it. And I think it, had tremendous, help with them. There's that principle of, when you are in meditation, you have that process of sitting with unpleasant feelings, or sitting with, trauma or your feelings, even if they're negative, even if they're positive feelings. There's that sense of observing, you're looking at your feelings from a unique perspective. And I always think that, that perspective is one akin to the self. You're surveying your ego from the position of the self. But there's lots of, the connection continues even today. So, for instance, the new strains of cognitive behavioral therapy, they hybridize with mindfulness and obviously the whole mindfulness thing as practiced by, or as developed by, John Kabat-Zinn in Massachusetts, the man who wrote A Full Catastrophe Living, and that too, it approaches the whole thing. It was based out of a hospital. The first, and I think he's still based out of a hospital. Dealing with people with very traumatic and difficult personal lives. He brought mindfulness to that, essentially removing the Eastern trappings of Buddhism and just introducing mindfulness as a technique, sitting with those emotions. And so, that connection between, therapy and meditation that was established in the countercultural era, it's still, it's almost tighter now than it ever was.
Well, I did a series of interviews many years ago with a Vipassana teacher, Shinzen Young, who pointed out to me that he felt Vipassana meditation could be used to cure addictions, even as severe as a heroin addiction, that if you sit with your cravings and you come to realize that it's just neurons firing and you have an aversion to the sensations, but you can detach yourself from all of that and you don't have to act on those cravings.
Yes, and it's very like the Gestalt, the Fritz Perls Gestalt therapy idea of proprioception, where you're watching the body, you're paying attention to the body, and that process of how that works. I think the example you give of Shinzen Young is very interesting as well, because I think it shows how that process, particularly of meditation, has, if you drill down to its absolute essence, has at its core the ideas of non-attachment. And so, we tend to see meditation used out of context, but with that idea of sitting with your feelings and observing your feelings, right there is this idea of, in a positive way, withdrawing, standing back, not clinging to anything, which is a fundamental Buddhist principle. And so, that's a very good example of how the Buddhist practice, is in some ways more sophisticated than the later version. So the mindfulness as it now exists in apps and things. You have to pursue it to its logical conclusion to get the real meaning of it.
Well, I think in the West, it was the case that a lot of people have gravitated to meditation because what it could do for them. You could be more successful in business if you can calm yourself down, or your health will improve, or you work through your emotional problems. Or, you might become a better actor or an actress, or you'll be more beautiful, more radiant as a person. But I gather that in the original teachings, none of those things were considered the purpose of meditation.
That's completely correct. But it's such a big a big subject. I mean, so for instance, Maharishi Yogi, his brand of Vedic meditation, TM, he would always advise against practitioners using the Omkara, so saying Om, because in his view that would dissolve their personality too much, and that if you were what they describe as a householder and you did the Omkara, you would soon find you didn't have you'd lose your wife, you'd lose your house. So there does exist, in some sense, that concern for the ego, but absolutely, I mean, the idea of ethics is certainly one which has gone missing. I mean, I have a colleague who's written an excellent book, Mindfulness, which is a very sharp critique of how mindfulness has completely forgotten this ethical component.
Well, there's some very interesting examples of people who have engaged in meditation for a variety of purposes, and it didn't even apparently work for them. You write about Jack Kerouac, for example, who really got heavily into meditation, but died as a severe alcoholic.
Kerouac's case is interesting from a lot of points of view. I think not least because there was a tradition, or there was a sense that the American importation of these disciplines did happen many times alongside drugs, alongside stimulants. And I know that Kerouac, as I say, Trungpa was someone who actually spoke openly about the use of alcohol within meditation. I think that marijuana was reasonably accepted as well. I mean, it was part and parcel of that whole culture as it came to America. And there are arguments that that it belonged in there. I know that that there are arguments that the use of drugs, certainly going back to looking at the Rig Veda and the use of soma there, that drugs belonged in that mix. But there's arguments and counter arguments. But in Kerouac's case, I think that I know that he visited D.T. Suzuki, and who could see that he was someone who was struggling with alcohol, and he tried to turn Kerouac onto matcha, which is the ground green tea, as a kind of a legitimate high that he could use to spice up his meditation. But I think that Kerouac was too troubled a soul, and in spite of his best efforts to leave alcohol behind, it got the better of him in the end.
These days, there is a concept, I've done an interview about it, it's referred to as a spiritual bypass, where people get involved in yoga and meditation, and they may achieve a measure of tranquility, but at the same time, they're not doing the inner work of addressing their problems. And as a result, sooner or later, those problems come back to bite them.
This is the problem with meditation. It's especially some forms of meditation. I think the Vedic. I make the distinction between etheric meditation, so those techniques of the mantra, for instance, that point one more towards the self and can generate their own natural high, and those especially, I think, can have create a sort of quite a withdrawn personality. Even Buddhist meditation, could do the same thing and create, like you say, a spiritual bypass. And I think it's a case of getting in touch with, those core principles. I mean, the whole concept, even of Vedic meditation, is that if consciousness is our individual consciousness is a small fraction of the entire consciousness, and so from that principle we can argue that, if I cut my brother, I'm cutting myself. And so, that sense of compassion that's inherent in that idea often goes missing. Jung was very, very strong on that, and he also believed in this idea of pathogenic sin, which is also quite strong in the Vedic traditions, that we are all miserable sinners, and so that connecting to that sense of compassion, it should be a vital component of meditation, but regrettably, it so easily cannot be.
Now, I have the impression that in Asia, in China, and particularly in India, the cultures from which meditation arose, that actually only a tiny percentage of the population are regular practitioners of meditation. If they're in an ashram or some sort of a monastery, the average person doesn't necessarily practice meditation at all. But here in the West now, it's becoming more of a mass movement. People are encouraged to practice meditation in all walks of life, and I suppose as a result of that, the practice is actually spreading more across the cultures of Asia as well. Would you say?
I think it's very possible that, there was these currents bounce backwards and forwards. Certainly in my research, it was very striking the way, for instance, Osho was very fascinated by the psychoanalytic ideas of Wilhelm Reich. Or there's the almost extraordinary situation whereby the Prabhupada, the Hare Krishna leader, he visits India with in 1970, I think it was, with these what he described as his dancing white elephants. But obviously, all his students were white Westerners, and I think that the crowds seeing them, parading through the streets were just astonished. So yeah, I think that's the way culture works. It's not straightforward, and I think it's very possible that meditation could go like that. I think it's partly the context of the fact that a lot of people engage with it through these apps, which is immediately a globalized phenomenon on people's telephones. So it's not really attached to anything anymore in that pure sense, which is it's interesting.
Well, one of the big impetuses in Western meditation was when Herbert Benson wrote the book, The Relaxation Response, in which he tried to take the essence of transcendental meditation and isolate it completely from its spiritual context and simply say, 20 minutes of repeating a soothing syllable twice a day helps the whole nervous system and helps reduce stress. I think that did a lot to sort of introduce the practice into mainstream culture, because now that I think about it, many Christian organizations were very askance at the idea that Westerners would be practicing a form of a Hindu ritual.
Yes, and I think there was a very similar case where there was a book called Stretching, which was just yoga repackaged. So I think the Christian institutions seem to be much more relaxed about meditation now. I know my mother-in-law, who's a Christian, she meditates. I think that there is one interesting aspect that slightly goes missing in that translation, which is that the process for a sort of a transcendental effect. I think that Ramakrishna, whose Gospel of Ramakrishna was very widely read in the countercultural era. His formula for Vedic meditation is go to a quiet place. So this idea of withdrawal or pratyahara, which is a kind of form of sensory deprivation, and say God's name, which in his case would have been Kali, or because he was a Kali worship, or Krishna, and so. And the way that this kind of devotional mechanism works so exquisitely is that you tune in to this kind of mode of adoration and this kind of focal point of obsession, in a way, of this kind of spiritual container, and that you sort of pour your affection into it. It's the same kind of dynamic that people have when they make a sort of personal altar or something like that. You pour all your affection and your attention and your love, in some ways quite similar to the way people would have reacted to the Beatles. They would have had Beatles posters on their walls, and they would have cradled the Sgt. Pepper's record cover, and that sort of focus requires some object of its affection. And so this is one of the masterful dimensions of Hindu culture, with all this pantheon of gods. You could just get so into Ganesh, or you can get really into Vishnu, and you can Shiva, and you can say Shiva's name over and over again, and you can imagine Shiva in these contexts. And again, with the Buddhist context, you have your Mahakala, and you can just really get into Mahakala, or you can really get into Avalokiteshvara, and you can imagine him, and you can. And I think that when you remove that sort of context, you end up with something which is less potent. So the example you're given of Benson's book, with just saying a word over and over again, takes out some of that transcendental power that is inherent in the meditation process, in my view, I think.
Within Buddhism itself, which is only one branch of a meditative tradition, you have the Vajrayana techniques, which involve detailed visualizations and close connection with a tutelary deity. On the other hand, you have Zen, which is very minimalist. The idea is really just be here now. You don't need anything special. Just appreciate the moment. You don't even have to close your eyes.
No, yes, you just sit there. That process of zazen, where you sit and you just be in the present. That's very much like the vipassana aspect of sort of integral meditation. I would see it, and like you say, on the other hand, the Vajrayana with these visualizations, the mandala. As a kind of a technique of visualization, and you imagine yourself entering the mandala, going through these different states. I mean, Lama Govinda's book, Foundations of Tibetan Mysticism, is fascinating on this, on the processes and the ideas of the mandala, and how the mantras, endlessly profound meanings, map onto that. And I think that those for me are very much like two poles. In a way, the Zen shares a lot with the Theravadan meditation, which the Vipassana, or Satipatthana, I think it is, and that sort of bare attention and clear comprehension, which is those principles of that. So yeah, I mean, it's a full spectrum, and it's never one thing or the other. I mean, even Ramakrishna, who always strikes me as being, a sort of example of the person who most embodies that transcendental style of meditation. He would go into these extraordinary fainting spells of samadhi, where he would be intoxicated by this sort of divine energy, and would literally he would zonk out, and his students would stand around like, oh my God, he's in samadhi again. But even he would say, that the ego exists, that I can only go into these states for a few hours, and then I come back from them. So and he would also use different techniques, and Trungpa would advise his students to do vipassana and samatha. So they would concentrate on objects like a flame or a picture, which is very much this etheric style of clearing the water. And on the other side, Trungpa would ask them just to sit there. He said to Ginsberg, the essence of it is you must sit. and which is, of course, the other aspect. So yeah, I mean, it's never clear cut.
In this day and age, you and I and the viewers of this channel are the inheritors of all of these traditions, and including, I should mention, various Western forms of meditation that have been around for centuries. And it seems to me, maybe just because I'm something of a dilettante, it's okay to practice a variety of techniques, to become familiar with them all. It's part of the language of consciousness in our culture right now.
Well, I think that's a very balanced way of looking at it, and I think that's right. I mean, it's part of the language of meditation. I think it would be helpful for people to be able to distinguish between one and the other. I mean, in my own practice, I do the Vipassana, the Varieties. I do that very often, all the time, and then I sort of titrate it with, if I just do that on its own, sometimes I find myself getting despondent or ruminating, and then if I use the mantra, it's like a pick me up. It's a bit like having something to bring you up and something to bring you down. But I think that there is a problem in some respects with the confusion, I certainly from my view, of that dynamic. Something like, mindfulness, Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness is a huge collision of, proprioception, so Gestalt therapy ideas, and self-hypnosis ideas and ideas of visualization. And I think it gets a bit harder to tell where you're going. I mean, if you can't see what tool is being used for what, then I think it's confusing.
I think it's very useful to have a clear sense of why you want to meditate in the first place. I know I, for example, did an interview, I'll link to it now, with Stephan Schwartz, a parapsychologist who provided insight into his preferred method of meditation. And basically it was problem solving. He said, think of a problem that you need to solve and then go into a quiet space and wait. And very often after 20 minutes or so, an answer will come up for you. It seems very useful, very practical and relaxing at the same time, but quite different than what we've been talking about so far.
That sounds very reasonable. It's quite like that thing of when one's sitting at a desk staring at a screen, one can't figure it out. You go and on a superficial level, you go around for a walk around the block, and there's your solution. If I've simplified it too much into this idea of integral and etheric meditation, there is that whole there is an aspect of the Buddhist meditation of which is the clear comprehension. I think I might have mentioned it in passing, which is really a sort of an evaluation. It's a sort of often an ethical evaluation. So the Dalai Lama, who gets up at 2 a.m. to meditate, he might say the Tara mantra or something like that, but often he's just thinking about a problem, or thinking about how he could do something better. I always think there's an interesting passage in How to Win Friends and Influence People, which is always, I think, a very interesting book, the Dale Carnegie book, where as an industrialist who every night he goes to bed and he thinks about how he could have been handled his day better, how he could have been more generous, less judgmental, more skillful, in the Buddhists would describe it. And so that too is a form of meditation.
Well, now we're getting into a very broad area that I would call inner work. When you're quiet and you go inside of your mind, there are probably an infinite number of things that you might do. Carl Jung engaged in what he called active imagination to explore the depths of his own unconscious mind. Other people who are Edison used to take naps, and in his naps he would come up with inventions. It was sort of his form of meditation. There is a sense in which I think people have the right and they have the power to define for themselves how they want to work with their own consciousness, with their mind-body system.
It was very interesting that you mentioned the young and the active imagination. That always it's interesting because as well that there's that aspect of meditation that is an appeal to something that is outside of ourselves, and so it does share with for instance the colleague that you've mentioned who asks for answers to problems. It's almost like a sense that something larger than ourselves that's guiding us.
In my own case, as a teenager, I learned self-hypnosis. And sometimes when I teach courses on meditation, visualization, self-hypnosis, the distinctions are very, very subtle. I think it's all part of a spectrum. I was able to use self-hypnosis very successfully as a young person to prepare myself for exams in school. It was a wonderful tool, and I can't say that I think it's very different from meditation at all.
When you asked me earlier on whether I meditated, I meant to ask you back, and so I'm glad that you volunteered that information. That's very interesting.
Well, Matthew, Ingram, has been a real pleasure having this conversation with you. I know we could talk for centuries about meditation, and it's been practiced for centuries, and it's a good conversation to keep coming back to over and over again. But this has been a delight, and as have our previous interviews been a delight. I want to once again encourage our viewers to take a look at your book, Retreat: How the Counterculture Invented Wellness. It's a marvelous book, scintillating writing. I hope to have you back on New Thinking Aloud often in the future, Matthew. Thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. I mean, the honor has been all mine. Thank you.
And for those of you listening or watching, thank you for being with us.